Hello students, I'm going to go through the period 7 test, go through a review for you to get you ready for the test coming up. Since this will only be on the second half of period 7, it will be a bit shorter of a test. It will be 23 multiple choice and 1 SAQ question. Essentially, it will cover from the end of World War I until the end of World War II. So let's start with the Great Migration. This is when Black Americans moved out of the South and into industrial cities, especially in that kind of 1920s time period after World War I up through World War II. It gave rise to a lot of cultural movements such as the Harlem Renaissance. We talked about like the Jazz Age and more social awareness of African American rights. We see an increase in African American literature and music and cultural kind of advancements for Black Americans. Part of the reason why many moved out of the South was to escape Jim Crow laws. They tried to escape segregation, prejudice. There's still things that are in effect, such as poll tax, literacy tests, lynching is still happening. FDR refused to sign an anti-lynching bill. It probably wouldn't have even made it to his desk, or didn't make it to his desk because the Senate probably wasn't going to pass it, but it was kind of dead before arrival even. And so as much as the Roosevelt coalition was helpful for Black Americans, or promising for Black Americans, there was still a lot of opposition and racism. Now, partly even in the northern cities, that was due to Depression era competition. Black Americans were competing for jobs in factories when really there's not a lot of jobs to be had. Let's talk about FDR. He was elected 4 times. The first one is in 1932. He takes office in March of 1933. And when FDR comes in, the United States is already in the Great Depression, which there's many factors for. You know, when FDR comes in, the stock market has already crashed in 1929 under Herbert Hoover. But there's things like bank failures, overproduction, high tariffs, speculation in the stock market. All of these things contributed to this terrible economic downturn in not only the United States, but really the whole entire world. And it resulted in a decade of very high unemployment, high debt, migrant workers, people trying to eke out a living as best as they could. So I put there, it began with Hoover. But even with FDR coming into power, it still didn't end until World War II. As much as FDR tried to stop the Great Depression, the New Deal legislation didn't really end the Great Depression. Some might argue it slowed it, it made it better, it increased people's hope, but it didn't end the Great Depression. Do know about those alphabet soup programs. Know the difference between relief, reform, and recovery. I have relief there in the middle, but remember, relief was immediate. It was often in the form of checks, of payments. It could also be employment that would have been not long-term employment, but short-term employment. Reform was really to prevent disasters. Things like stopping the kind of Dust Bowl era in the middle part of the United States. And then rebuilding. And rebuilding often was done in the employment sector, especially farming and housing. So this was a shift in government policy to a very hands-on approach, almost going beyond democratic reforms into socialism reforms, which is why a lot of people maybe fault FDR for taking too broad of a hand in the government. But something had to be done. Something had to change at that time. The way FDR tried to build support for his New Deal programs, and really just kind of for himself as a president, which is why partly he probably gets elected 4 times, but he did fireside chats. This was a mass media radio program. It helped FDR restore public confidence, build support for New Deal programs. We see the first one coming shortly after his inauguration with explaining what the bank closure, what the bank holiday it was called. And then we see way into World War II. So he often did several times a year speak to the American public. And the way he did it was really kind of a down to earth, friendly manner. And it felt like he was entering into people's homes and just explaining to them what was going on in the United States. Let's talk about FDR's court packing plan. This was after New Deal legislation was overturned. FDR failed to expand the Supreme Court of the United States to 15 to give favorable rulings. He felt like when the AAA was overturned and it's escaping me now. Another piece of legislation was overturned with Schechter Poultry. Anyway, but there were more coming up on the chopping block, is what I guess I'm trying to get to. There were more likely to be pieces of legislation from the New Deal legislation that was going to probably come before the Supreme Court. FDR was trying to stop that, but this makes it look like he's got a hand not only in the executive branch, but also really in the Supreme Court, and probably because he had such a great amount of favor in the legislative branch, it feels like he's abusing his power, and this does not make FDR look good at all. The Roosevelt Coalition is what we refer to as this kind of shift in voter alignment, party alignment. Happens really in the 1936 election, where we see, and this was a big win, like a gigantic win for Roosevelt. But it was often from the Roosevelt Coalition came from poor people, low income, African Americans, union members, ethnic minorities, religious minorities such as Catholics and Jews. So he's building this Roosevelt Coalition, which is going to be a strongly Democratic-based populace that will carry on for quite some time. In fact, we'll still see it as we get into FDR's and LBJ's presidency here in another 20 years. Let's talk about World War II. The United States was propelled into the war. We wanted to stay neutral. The war had begun in 1939 when Hitler invaded Poland, but we even know that it was happening, Japanese aggression was happening as early as the 1930s, early 1930s in China. But when Japan bombed Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, the aggression was hard, meaning like there was no staying neutral at that point. America had to fight in the war, and we very much entered into the war on both fronts, on the Pacific and the Atlantic fronts. Let's talk about Executive Order 9066, another FDR measure that he applied from the executive branch. It said that all people of Japanese ancestry were to be relocated to internment camps as a military necessity. Korematsu versus the United States came up. It came up before the Supreme Court shortly after. Actually, in a fairly short amount of time, it made its way to the Supreme Court, and SCOTUS held it, saying that it was okay to hold people in internment camps as a military necessity. And so Fred Korematsu did not win the case, and in fact, it took probably, I think it was under Ronald Reagan, before the United States ever formally apologized to Japanese Americans for denying their civil rights and taking away their liberties of freedom from, living as they wish. Speaking of freedoms, let's talk about FDR's 4 freedoms. He gave this speech in early in 1942, shortly after the United States was bombed, I don't know if the Senate or if Congress or the American people needed more justification, but what FDR talked about was why we're fighting in the war. Freedom from fear, freedom from want, the freedom of speech, and the freedom of religion. He gave it after Pearl Harbor to justify the need for involvement to right the wrongs of the world. So World War II does end the Great Depression. The New Deal legislation wasn't enough, as I mentioned. It was really the war production that ends. We had gone from, and I do want you to understand this, I don't think I explained it in class or it not enough. The United States for a while, quite some time, was on as a position of neutrality, was on a lend-lease basis, which means we would lend, we would let people borrow, and we would lease, kind of like a rental, if you will, war munitions, war material, planes and tanks and bombs and guns and things like that. We had a lend-lease agreement with European nations. That became a cash and carry system where we were literally just outright selling them. And we were in, sometimes it was just a matter of like giving them and we'll deal with the payment later. But this generated a lot of industrial production, lots of employment and production was for the war effort. And so it begins this very long period of economic growth. Part of the reason that World War II was so successful for both America and Americans was women on the home front. Very few women were involved as members of the military, but they gave a lot on the home front. Women, for instance, we talked about Rosie, the kind of propaganda woman, entered the workforce as a fighting force, but really not just a fighting force. They took on the war production many times, but even roles at home. For instance, women took part in growing victory gardens, rationing, to do their part for the war effort. Many took on these very non-traditional jobs, which was different from World War I. And I think we talked about that quite a bit in class. I want you to understand that World War I, women on the home front, and World War II, women on the home front, was different. First of all, it was on a much larger scale in World War II. But secondly, it was a different feeling after World War II than it had been in World War I. And women after World War II, now think about this, it would make sense because in World War I, women still did not have the right to vote. Women didn't get the right to vote until a couple years after World War I. Well, now by the time World War II comes around, women's suffrage rights are national suffrage rights, and women feel more empowered. Women feel like they can do what it needs to be done to help save the country and help win the war. And their efforts, they did not feel like it was okay to just return to the home. Some women did, and we will talk about the baby boom generation, which women returned to the home and they had lots of children. But there was also this kind of newfound sense of patriotism along with the freedom. Let's talk about the Double V campaign. Last thing. The Double V campaign was really an African American campaign to fight for the end of segregation, racism at home, and freedom, the democracy that we were fighting for overseas. They took very active roles in the military. The military, however, is still segregated. They showed their competence, bravery in World War II. For instance, I think I mentioned the Tuskegee Airmen. The Red Ball Express was a company that was a transportation company in the Army, almost exclusively made of African Americans who performed very valiantly after D-Day, moving troops and transport. So these are all very particular examples of the Double V campaign that African Americans have to really prove that they are just as worthy as white Americans, and that they are being unfairly treated. And African Americans have this kind of to fight freedom for the world, but as well as for themselves. Okay, so that's really it. It's pretty short. Like I said, there will be 23 multiple choice, 1 SAQ. They're all stimulus based. So you will have some sort of graph or reading or picture, something to analyze and answer questions about. All right, till we meet again. Goodbye.